Okay, you guys, so let's check this thing out. Like I said, one flesh, one covenant is the name of the article, and as you can tell, they're basically going to be going in the direction of talking about marriage as one flesh kind of situation between two people becoming one person, and that there's one covenant between those two people. They're going to talk about the importance of covenant. They're going to talk about the importance of two people coming together and being one, and they're going to eventually kind of take us in the direction of understanding why people would think that it's only the death of one person that would kind of undo this whole situation. So, really good article. I'm going to just try to hit the highlights, but it's great. You can check it out. Unfortunately, it comes in 4 parts, and you can find it again at Ephrata Ministries. So, you can find that online, and it's not too hard to find. It looks like it comes from the April, May, June of 2007 article. So anyway, what they're going to basically say is like that this is like a very personal issue, but they do need to talk about it, and kind of help give some direction. So in the beginning, it just talks about how the Pharisees came to Jesus and they wanted to tempt him, and they said to him, "Is it lawful to put away uh, a wife for any cause?" And Jesus goes all the way back to the very beginning. He references the first man, the first woman, and he says, rhetorically, he says, "Have you not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, For this cause a man shall leave his father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and the twain shall be one flesh." Matthew 19:4 and 5. So that was his response. Their takeaways are the biggest one here is becoming one flesh. This is the main point of what they're saying. They make an analogy of uh, how dirt and water, when combined, become like mud. That was from Job 38, and that you can't really separate out the two parts. Um, Mud is kind of mud. They use different things like this. They also reference 1 Corinthians 6:15 and 15 and 16, which says, "Know ye not that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take the members of Christ and make them members of a harlot? God forbid. What? Know ye not that he which is joined to a harlot is one body? For the two, saith he, shall be one flesh." So they're going to look at 4 or 5 different uh, verses and things that speak about this one flesh. For example, we were just in First Corinthians. First Corinthians? Yes, First Corinthians 6:15 and 16. Then we're going to jump over here to Ephesians 5. It says, "For this cause a man shall leave his father and mother, and shall be joined unto his wife, and the two shall be one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church." And so I think this is a really great one. One, because it highlights their ideas again about this one flesh kind of thing that's created. But it also hints at a topic we'll look here at in a second, which is essentially that the Christian marriage is, for many people who hold this view, a great picture of what an unbelieving world should look at and observe if they want to know who Christ is, if they want to know what God is like, that they should really look at Christ and the church through the lens of a man and woman married together in the bonds of marriage, a Christian marriage. And, you know, so the implications of, if you look at it in that context, is Christ going to abandon his spouse? Is he going to be unforgiving? Is he going to throw them away or cast them away? And that's the big question. Um, People in this view, they really say, no, he would not do such a thing. He wouldn't do such a thing. Like he is, um, he's forever faithful, that he's faithful even when we are not. And so they're going to say, therefore, the appropriate way to conduct marriage is to be like him, um, to not cast your people away, but to They talk about things like the prodigal son story, where the father stays waiting for the rebellious son to come home. A lot of different analogies, but just as a highlight. Anyway, again, they're looking at Adam and Eve. Eve being taken from Adam's rib, where he says, "This is, the bone of my bone, the flesh of my flesh." Uh, God could have made woman any way He wanted to, but He made her in this fashion. Why? Well, I would think that they would suggest because it's supposed to teach us something else about marriage. This is my conjecture. They don't say that. Anyway, again, we have Matthew 19:6. The two become one flesh. And then we see Jesus follow up, and He says, "What God hath joined together, let no man put asunder. Let no one, separate, or let no one, you know, push for divorce." So they say, well, then Jesus must not be a fan of divorce. Perhaps, perhaps. What does He mean? What does it all mean? Well, the next thing that they do is they go and they look at, how does God feel about divorce, about this putting away? Because He just said, what God has joined together, let no one put asunder. So the next thing they do is they jump to the Old Testament book of Malachi. And what we find in Malachi 2 is basically a situation where God's people are kind of in a mess, and they've been praying and they've been asking for Him to help them and to deliver them and to come to their aid. And He goes into silent mode. He's not going to help them. He doesn't respond to their requests. And they're asking Him, what's the deal? Why? And they're like, why don't you answer us? And He says, you say, wherefore? Because the Lord hath been witness between thee and the wife of thy youth, against whom thou hast dealt treacherously. Yet she is thy companion, and the wife of thy covenant. So you see there, covenant, again, that term, they'll get to that in a second. They're definitely going to highlight that. But, and the wife of thy covenant. And did He not make one? Again, one flesh. Yet had He the residue of the Spirit, and wherefore one? That He might seek a godly seed. So saying, why did He make them one? Why, all of this? Well, He wanted godly children to come forth from the marriage. Is what this seems to say to me. Therefore take heed to your spirit, and let none deal treacherously against the wife of his youth. For the Lord, the God of Israel, said that He hateth putting away. And you'll hear that quoted all the time. People say, God hates divorce, God hates divorce, God hates divorce. And, well, I think He does. But what they're trying to really communicate to us is that this covenantal aspect, that it can't be overlooked, and that, many people, they overlook it, essentially, is what they're going to go on to say. So the next point they kind of move on to is that a lot of modern people, we don't make a lot of covenants, vows, or keeping our word in certain circumstances. Business, it's debatable. I think even in businesses, the way people conduct their business, it depends, who we're talking about. But anyway, their point is that there's a lot of verses. Numbers 30, Deuteronomy 23, Psalm 15, Leviticus 27, Ecclesiastes 5, Judges 11. All these verses, right? That basically talk about why it's important to keep our vows, why, this is something that God expects people to do, and that when people don't, that it is it's a problem. It says, clearly teaches us that it is a sin not to perform our vows. And so first, they really start us off with this idea that a man and a woman, when they become married, they become one flesh. And their second point that they're really trying to get us to understand is that they see that there's a covenant. And a covenant is made by making a vow, two people making a vow, and that it's sinful to break a vow. So then they move on. Well, can any vow be broken? And they bring up things like, well, what if you take you sign up and you give your word to be part of a cult, or What if you take a vow of abstinence or celibacy or poverty? Can you never, you know, go back on those things? Do we always have to keep our word in in every situation, every circumstance? And so they say, well, uh, you know, what they say is essentially, uh, perhaps, perhaps we will be able to address this concern in a future article. But their point is right now is, let it suffice to say that vows have always been a very serious thing in the eyes of God, from the Old Testament right on through to the teachings of Jesus. And then they bring up this really great thing. I told you guys I thought this was a great article, and this is one of the things that I think they do really well. They make this observation that we might miss. He says, do you think that it's just coincidence that right after Jesus' teaching on adultery, divorce, and remarriage in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, that he immediately introduces his teachings on oaths? That's really cool. I mean, I think that's a really worthwhile point to make, that the two are connected and that Jesus connects them. He makes a specific point to go right from marriage directly into talking about being people of our word, following through on what we say we'll do, and things like that. Um, Now, this is the hard part. In the beginning of the article, of this section anyway, he starts by talking a lot about how um, discipleship is to take up your cross and follow Christ, that it's very, serious, that we must love God more than we love our own lives, or more than we love our mother, or more than we love our father, more than we love our children, more than we love our spouse, that he is to be the top priority. And anyway, to conclude part one, he basically just says that the call to follow Christ um, is one where a person really gives up their rights, and that Paul talks about being a bondservant, about being a slave, about that God really sits on the throne and he is in the authority, and that we're to follow his ways, his instructions. And even if we don't understand it, or it seems very countercultural. Now, this is one part that I'll say that we should really be careful, because he says here, the essence of the teaching of Jesus is the cross: complete self-denial, complete abandonment of self-rights and self-interests. I just want to pause, and I would say in my life that's gotten me into some trouble, because people will, come to you, in the name of Christ, and say, well, we need your help, we need you to do this thing, or we need you to commit to this thing, you need to give time or money or whatever, because Christ gave everything, and, we are following in his footsteps. And what I've come to learn through making some missteps in that is that sometimes I've bitten off more than I can chew, that my ideals of, God says that we should each make an honest estimation of the faith that we have. So sometimes in the past, I thought that I've been able just to do things that I would gather up my faith, that God would, the things I thought about God, the things I thought about myself, and just really go big or go home, as they say. So I went big, and then once I kind of got into some things, I really realized, man, I don't know that I really was ready to make this kind of decision. I might have, you know, agreed to some things in my words that I wasn't 100% of my heart ready to pay the full price for. And that's the thing that I'd say to be really careful about is, if you follow this guy's advice, and that you do something that you're not fully convinced you're ready to do, or you've counted the costs, as they say, you need to do that first. You can't try to please these guys, or please your pastor, or please your friend, and go and try to seek some marriage restoration when you're not all in, when you're not really ready to do the work completely, or if you're thinking that you need to get out of if you come to the decision that you're in a unbiblical adulterous marriage or some kind of bad relationship, maybe you're engaged to be remarried, and to break that thing off, if you don't do that with a full conscience, if you do that for somebody else or because it's their view, and you're kind of sitting on the fence, you're still 50-50 about what's right and what's wrong, you're going to get a kind of down the road, and you're going to feel, I'm telling you, you're going to feel like cheated or tricked, or that you regret, making the decision that other people pressured you into. And that might have been, people might have pressured you to divorce your husband or wife, and now you're kind of in this situation where you feel like maybe you should go back, but I think you guys get what I'm saying. It's just like there's these ultra high ideals in Christianity about being able to, move mountains and change the world, and overcome persecution and death and the sword and all this stuff. Just be real. I mean, just be real of where you really are, and if you're really ready to go all in like that. Because if you're not, I think it's easy to get hyped up, read some article and say, that's right, I can do anything. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And there's that other parable, about the parable of the sower, where the seed goes in, maybe the truth from this message goes in, and maybe it sounds good today, but it lands on the path, and by Tuesday of next week, the birds have come in and distracted you and stolen those truths away. You forgot about it and you're giving up. Or maybe you're gonna maybe you're that kind of soil where there's still some weeds, some thorns in your life, and as soon as it gets hard, those troubles and those difficulties are going to choke out your beliefs and your hope, and that's not going to go well either. We need to be that good soil type of people. That's what I'm saying. Work with God until He cultivates in you the place where you're really ready, like that you're going to be able to stand in faith and in prayer for whatever He has you to do, whether it's leave a situation or go into a difficult situation or wait when nothing's happening or whatever He might ask you to do. I just think it's really smart to get to the place where you're yielded to God, because if not, I don't see it going well, no matter how persuasive and these articles are. Anyway, so the second part is just continuing on the same thing. Again, Malachi, these people wanted help. God wouldn't help them because of the way they were dealing with their spouses. We look at Luke and we see this thing right here where it's just if a person were to divorce their spouse and marry another, that they would commit adultery. And if someone marries a divorced person, they commit adultery. I'll take an aside or just a second, and I will say that as you read through articles like this, eventually, to me, the $1 million question, the $100 million question becomes, what ends a marriage? So, like in this situation, this putteth away. Many, many, many people just say that this is a situation where people are essentially separated. The marriage still holds, the covenant is still there. And so if you go marry somebody else while you're only separated from your spouse, that's going to be adultery. That's essentially what they say, because, I mean, for all functional purposes, they say that there's really no such thing as divorce, like as the way it's normally understood. They're just saying that once people are married, they're always married until death do them part. So you can just throw divorce basically out of the window in their minds. All you really have is just people are always married. They're either married and living together happily, or they're separated, um, each are single, or they're separated and one or both are living in adulterous outside relationships. So, however, there's a whole other camp that says no, like certain sins break a marriage and cause it to come to an end. It's done. You can separate the dirt from the water. You can, divide the clay up into two pieces. And as painful as that is, it can be done. And so they would say it can be done by certain sexual sins, which are totally up for controversy as well, as far as, we'll get into that. But yeah, it can be undone. And once it's undone, they would say, a lot of people would say, well, then if it's undone, then the people are essentially just single people again, and single people are allowed to get married. In fact, it's impossible for a person to have an adulterous situation with another single person, because two single people neither are in marriages. So that's a little bit of a wordplay, but I want you guys to really, when you think about these things and look at these verses, basically, one camp would say like divorce ends it, and the other people would say there's no such thing as divorce. I mean, forget about divorce. It's just some paperwork at some government building. It doesn't mean anything. Or it might be some social convention that you have a bunch of friends that say, yeah, we're, once you sign on the dotted line, there's no such, the whole spiritual side of everything just goes away. And, well, those are your two camps. Those really are your two camps. Now, this guy, John Piper, he's a pretty big, influential evangelist and author. I think he comes from the Northern Baptist, Northern Baptist denomination. He said, all my adult life, until I was faced with the necessity of dealing with divorce and remarriage in the pastoral context, I held the prevailing Protestant view that remarriage after divorce was biblically sanctioned in cases where divorce had resulted from desertion or persistent adultery. There's a whole lot here. One, desertion. Many people don't think that desertion applies if you're dealing with two Christians, although he says for him it did. And persistent adultery. Again, some people say persistent adultery versus a one-time adulterous action. Which is it? But it's not really his point. His point is that he eventually began studying Ephesians 5, and he became increasingly persuaded that there is a deep and profound significance to the union of husband and wife in one flesh as a parable to the relationship between Christ and his church. I think many people that get into this view that we're looking at here, it's called the marriage permanence view, is they've been swayed by this aspect where they see Christian marriage as a representation of how Christ is and how God is relating to his church, his quote unquote, his bride, and that Christian marriages among people are supposed to reflect how God is and how he relates to his church. The reason they think that this is such a big deal, and the way they explain why all of this don't get remarried stuff makes sense to them, is that they say it's important because an unbelieving world needs to have an accurate picture of who God is. And one of the most common ways that an unbelieving world gets a picture of who God is by looking at the way Christians interact within their marriages. And so they say that if you see a bunch of Christians getting divorced and remarried, or divorced for kind of frivolous reasons or small reasons, what would an unbelieving world think? They would think that many things, maybe that God isn't really going to be committed to them for the long term, that God doesn't empower Christians, or maybe that God himself doesn't really have the power to forgive, that all this talk of the work at the cross and the unconditional love of God, or the the unfailing love of God for those who believe. Maybe they would say, it doesn't seem like it really holds true in all circumstances. Maybe they think that it's just a bunch of nonsense that you know Christ could pay a price on the cross and that it would forgive the sins of everybody. Maybe at the end of the day, it's always back to works. And you could see, I mean, without going into it, that if people are going to say, well, this is why it's such a big deal, it does carry a lot of weight. It's not just one man out there and one woman and maybe their kids. It has profound implications for their community, the proclamation of who God is to the entire world, both to the unbelieving world as well as to other Christians within their sphere of influence. So that's what they say. That's what John Piper, this gentleman, seemed to have. So anyway, they're going to go back into this thing. They've talked about the one flesh. They've talked about the covenant. They're going to go back and highlight real quick. Don't forget about the one flesh thing. Don't forget about the one flesh thing. And then they're going to say, well, what about the divorce question? And they're going to look at all these verses that you can look at. One that I think would be really interesting is this one from Ezra 10:31. That one will kind of blow your socks off if you, that's quite a strange story, but it definitely doesn't say that, I'll let you guys read it. But it's basically a story that says, look, a person can get married and it be a wrong thing, and if it's a wrong thing, they should leave. And in fact, that has happened before. People decided, hey, we got into these bad marriages with these women we shouldn't have married, and it's wrong, and so we're going to repent, and repentance means we're going to divorce them, and we're not going to be involved with them anymore. And that happened, Ezra 10. So this is one of those things that it's a bit obscure, but pretty interesting. So what about the Old Testament law of divorce? Basically, the argument is like, okay, if there's no divorce, as you're suggesting, then why can we turn to this passage in Deuteronomy 24 and see that Moses allowed the people to give a written document of divorce? And this is exactly what they ask him. You can see Deuteronomy 24 here, and that these guys are asking Jesus about this very question in Matthew 15. And he said, Matthew 19, sorry. And Jesus replied, because of the hardness of your hearts, you were given permission to put away your wives, but it was not so from the beginning. Now, this translation is kind of specific, but I'll tell you, you can find other translations that are more ambiguous, and you don't even know whose heart was hardened. So, here's 4 examples. Say it's the person who does the divorcing. Say their heart is hard. So maybe it's like they don't want to be forgiving, so they have a hard heart. Or they don't want to be a person of their word, so they have a hard heart. Or maybe it's like they didn't really have decent grounds for getting a divorce, like there was no sexual immorality. Let's say if that's the one thing that kind of could allow them to go for divorce. If there was nothing like that in their situation, they still wanted out. Well, maybe they had a hard heart because they kept bothering Moses and they kept saying, hey, we got the governor to sign off on this or something, and the government will allow us to do it. So we're just going to go ahead and do it. And, Moses, why don't you just help us now figure out what we can do? Something like that, where they just kind of forced his hand, they kind of bugged him. Or what if it's not that they're the ones with the hard hearts? Maybe it's the people who were left. So maybe they weren't very fun to be around, could be an argument. Or, maybe they didn't earn enough, or they didn't take care of themselves, or all these things that we talk about, all these reasons why people break up. Maybe they were unfaithful, they had a hard heart, and so they wouldn't repent from their sin, or whatever, whatever the hardness of heart is. But it could be on either person, and you don't really know who had the hard heart in every translation. Like this one says, when a man had taken a wife and married her, and it came to pass that she found no favor in his eyes, because he had found some uncleanliness in her. So a lot of people debate about what that means and, what are the implications. Suppose you do find something unclean, like what is that? Like whatever, it could be frivolous or it could be, serious, like some sexual thing maybe before the couple met, or some sexual thing during the engagement, or some sexual sin during the marriage. Or it could, I mean, some people it just meant that, they weren't very good at parenting or some weird stuff like that. And so it's all kind of reasons, I mean, if you could think it up, I'm sure it's happened. So these people are trying to sort it out. The point that they come down on is that what was Moses really saying when he said that famous statement in Deuteronomy 24? And what he actually was doing was that there was already a law. Let's see. Basically, what they're saying is that Moses didn't say, "Hey, we came up with this new thing called divorce, and we want you guys to we want to install it in the country." What he was saying was that there was already a bunch of divorces happening, and that this was just a way to regulate this kind of thing. I don't know. I think about it like the war on drugs or something. When a country can't control the drugs, or this happened a lot with abortions when they weren't able to kind of stop the black market trade, so to speak. They just said, you know what, we can't stop it, so the next best thing we can do is regulate it. We'll figure out a way to kind of make it safer and tax it and make sure that the quality is, like higher, and there's not, like murders. It's not this black market kind of under the cover thing. And maybe that's the best we can do. So that's kind of what they're saying. It says Moses did not institute divorce. He merely regulated against a type of remarriage. This passage provided at least three regulations. One, it prevented the woman from being traded and passed around like merchandise. Two, it curtailed remarriage for a woman in this condition. And three, it reinstated the husband, calling him to know that he cannot just act indiscriminately about sending his wife away. So they're saying that this is the law that was created to protect the woman, not to reject her, but basically make the guy think twice, or the woman think twice, whoever did the divorcing. That it's like, hey, if you act impulsively or emotionally and you divorce somebody, if you haven't really thought this through, you might get a chance to work things out with them. But if they remarry, that opportunity is gone for you forever, and you're not going to get a chance to, come to your senses and work things out with someone that you love, or with the parent or mother or father of your child or children, because you acted hastily and now it's too late. So they argue that that's what was going on. That it wasn't a, hey, divorce is good. It's, hey, if you're going to kind of do this thing, break up your family, this is kind of how it needs to work. And there's some limits. You can't just divorce and marry people and do whatever. We're going to put some limitations on it. Anyway, now we get into this. They jump into this other thing. They get into the words of Jesus, and they start talking about these really hard passages, like when Jesus said, if you look at a woman lustfully, you've committed adultery with her already in his heart. I think it's fair. I don't know. What do you guys think? But I think there's a big difference between sleeping with somebody and, having that thought that, wow, that's a very sexually attractive person to me, and, whatever, like they're sexually appealing, I guess you could say. That there's a difference between that versus maybe that's like observing a sexually fit person, or a well-proportioned person, an in-shape person, or someone with like a good personality or good emotional, kind of state, and being attracted to that versus lusting after them versus acting upon that lust. But Jesus said, it's like he's a person that has lusted after someone else has already committed adultery with them in his heart, on the, I guess, mental side of things, because in his heart has to mean something. He didn't just say has committed adultery, period. No, he said in his heart. So I think that's different than taking another man's wife to bed. But what they say is that So basically why they bring this up is that they're wanting to show us that there's different ways of being guilty of adultery besides actually sleeping with someone when you're married. So for one, you can look lustfully at someone else and you can be guilty of adultery in your heart. Or two, you can inappropriately divorce your spouse and cause them to become an adulterer, and therefore you bear the burden of their guilt. It says, because of this, he is therefore guilty of her adultery along with her. So, I don't know, this is a weird thing. I'll just say this is a weird thing. Because it could be that, well, I don't understand why more people don't kind of argue this, that it's like, hey, I'm living in a an adulterous second marriage, but it's not my fault. Like, I didn't want to get divorced. I tried to work things out. They wouldn't work with me, so I got remarried. And yeah, I'm in an adulterous second marriage, but the guilt, it goes on them and not on me. I never hear people say this. I never hear this point argued. And I'm guessing it's because in order to make that argument, you kind of have to first make the admission that there's some fundamental flaw in your relationship. And people probably wouldn't want to think that or have that kind of always in the back of their mind that, like, this is adultery, but it's not my fault. Like, this is adultery, this is bad, but it's not on me. Like, to always like be running a relationship like that with that as the foundation. It's like, this is wrong, but we're going to transfer the guilt to my ex. I don't know. No one ever says that. Maybe because this verse or this author tends to think that if that were to be the situation, that like some of the guilt would go uh, to each person. Yeah, it says like he explained that a man by divorcing his wife was guilty of causing her to fall into adultery. I don't necessarily see why if that was the case, that she would bear any of the guilt. I mean, if he caused it, then why is she guilty? But this guy definitely says that she is for some reason when he says along with her, that he is therefore guilty of her adultery along with her. I guess maybe the idea is that there's no innocent parties in life, period, or in divorce, that both people contributed to the breakdown. No one plays it perfectly, and so maybe she's somewhat guilty as well. I don't know. It's tough. But it gets even, I mean, more difficult as he says that Jesus caps off his list of adulteries, including even the man. So say you had a single man who's never been married, and he marries a woman who was previously married and divorced. It says that now he's guilty of of adultery. Yeah. And whosoever marrieth her which is put away doth commit adultery. So you can see that they're kind of making a strong argument. They're really saying, look, I mean, we have many examples. We have this one flesh thing. We have this covenant thing. We have these rules that people should, keep their oaths and keep their vows. And then you have all this stuff that it seems like, whether you got left or you did the leaving, that there's going to be some guilt of adultery coming your way. If you marry a divorcee, there's going to be some guilt coming your way. Um, and so, yeah, it's like summarizing, they're saying divorcing a spouse for any reason except for fornication is to be guilty of causing your spouse to commit adultery. Uh, or divorcing a wife and marrying another is adultery. Or marrying someone who is divorced is adultery. So it's like, man, there's not a lot of ways to get out of this thing. And this is the other interesting thing. I talked about this in another video, but So how long does the sin of adultery last? Like, is it like, what are we talking about? Like one instance of adultery on the honeymoon, and then after that, God's going to bless the marriage from that point forward, the second marriage, or is he going to be like always having a problem with it? And he says, the question remains, is this a one-time sin or is it an ongoing sin? And who is this person? John Koblenz, What the Bible Says About Marriage, Divorce, and Remarriage. He looks at the Greek words and he says the Greek verb tense translated committeth adultery in Mark 10, 11, and 12 is present indicative, suggesting continuous action. It means is committing adultery. The adultery is not only in the past, it began when the second relationship began and continues as long as the relationship continues. The remarriage is ongoing adultery against the former companion as long as that companion lives. So that's why you see that certain people, they will even say, look, even if there's children that came as a consequence of the second marriage, that the right thing to do is stop the adultery. Like, it's not going to get better, and many people will object on. I just saw a video where a guy basically he spent the whole objection to this marriage permanence view. His whole objection was built upon this basically argument that just used the children as like shields. I mean, it's just like he just took the children and said like, what about these poor children? Like, it was an emotional appeal all the way. There was nothing about, what does the scripture say or anything like that. It was just this idea that like divorce is hurtful to kids, and so, never should. Like that's the end of the story. Never should any of these other things that we're talking about here matter. He just says the poor kids, think about the poor kids, and that's all he really had to say. I mean, that's just like all he said for 8 minutes. He just said that this whole thing was illogical, but he didn't approach it from a really too much of a logical approach. He really approached it from an emotional standpoint in his argument. Anyways, part 3. This is really interesting. So the exception clause. Now everyone wants to talk about the exception clause. When is the exception? Matthew 19. I did a video about Desiderius Erasmus. He was a Catholic priest, translator, and changed both the Greek and the Latin. To me, I still want to research it a little bit further, but it appears that he made some additions which kind of allowed for this exception clause that's found in Matthew. Like I said before, it's only in Matthew that you find this exception clause, in Matthew 5 and in Matthew 19. If you flip over to Mark, if you flip over to Luke, there's no exception clause in those. So if you missed that before, I'll just highlight that, and you can kind of ask yourself, well, why the difference? This chart, it says non-denominational folks experience percent 34% of the time. So 34% of non-denominational members have been divorced. Baptist 29, born again, whatever that is, 27. Mainline Protestants 25. Mormons, Catholics, dropping. Catholics and Lutherans at 21%. Right next with atheists and agnostics, 21%. And that's the thing that's really has confused me. I saw this in another article I did. I think it was a study that came out of Arizona State University, and it said that for predicting marriage dissolution or divorce, that one of the big contributing factors was if the guy was highly religious, if the husband was highly religious, and that was a big contributor, even bigger contributor than like, if either partner had numerous sexual partners previously. And I was like, man, I mean, why is that? I don't really know why that is. Maybe this would suggest that that the culture is more atheist and secular than it is Christian. I mean, maybe you're saying that if you're a real serious Christian person, there's going to be a lot of conflict for you in life. And if your spouse is, significantly influenced by secular ideas, that when you go and you get, really serious when the rubber hits the road and it really comes to crunch time, if you're a person that doubles down on what the Bible says, that is going to be pretty countercultural, and maybe it leads to some marital strife. I don't know, I'm just theorizing, but this is really interesting. Unfortunately, they don't, as far as I saw, give you a quote about where these numbers came from, but it is quite dismal. And I've been in non-denominational churches for like a long time, and it's like basically that's the worst of the worst, according to this, which is it's pretty eye-opening. It's pretty sad, but maybe it's just from these views that you can get divorced for any reason. I don't know. Again, just thinking out loud. But anyway, they're just going to go review the one flesh thing, that if you divorce your spouse for any reason except for fornication, you're going to cause someone else to commit adultery, and that blame is going to be somewhat upon you, maybe upon them as well. But to answer all these questions, simply put, is that Jesus taught that marriage bond was indissoluble outside of the death of a spouse. Therefore, any other union is considered adultery, no matter what we may do, be it to legally divorce, separate, or just plain don't get along. Nothing can separate the marriage union except death. And Paul said that in 1 Corinthians 7 as well, is what they're saying. And so the simple words is, and I just highlighted this, you'll notice this is what I said before. This is the Mark passage, down here is the Luke passage, and you'll notice there's no exception clause. It goes from wife, there's no exception clause, and marries another. Wife, no exception clause, and marries another. So these two things, it's only in Matthew that you have any exception clause at all. So if you didn't have Matthew, you would basically be dealing with a situation based on these two verses where it's like, if you get married and then you get divorced and you marry someone else, no ifs, ands, or buts, you're in adultery. Like no ifs, ands, or buts. And the only thing that really changes that is what we see in those verses in Matthew, which again are weird because, I think Matthew, one of them puts the guilt upon the divorcee, and the other puts kind of the guilt on the divorcer. Anyway, so when did the confusion start? And this is what I talked about. You'll see this during the Reformation. The Catholic theologian Erasmus, Desiderius Erasmus, had this translation of the scriptures, and that Martin Luther and John Calvin, these big Protestant reformers, basically used those translations to build a lot of their theology from. And so, they basically came down that they taught that Jesus' strong prohibition against remarriage had one exception, and that was adultery. So before it was like, was it adultery? Was it just some kind of sexual anything? Does it have to be adultery? Was it lusting after somebody? Well, here now they're saying, nope, none of that stuff, just adultery. And it says that this view, however helpful it may have seemed at the time, rendered the essence of Jesus' one flesh teaching on marriage as conditional, meaning that now we kind of have this like I said before, the $100 million question is, what are the circumstances that can get rid of this one flesh thing, that can get rid of this covenant thing? Is it just death only, or are there other things like adultery, for example, or any sexual sin, for example, or desertion, or whatever, bad parenting, or whatever. But this is what he says is the real problem, and I think this is at the heart of this article. This author, when writing this article, it says what started out as a small exception or loophole in Jesus' strong prohibition against divorce and remarriage grew exponentially into the crisis situation we now face as a church. So why is it a crisis situation? Well, we're supposed to be the people of God. We're supposed to be empowered by the Holy Spirit to live better lives, to have the fruit of the Spirit, and boom, the people without God are, quite frankly, embarrassing us when it comes to marriage success. If this chart is correct, 34%, 21%. They're killing us. It's like basically if we're going to go back to that idea of like, what message are we sending to an unbelieving world? If Christ is true and if the Holy Spirit is real, basically we're telling the whole world that it's like, no, he's not. You know, if you look at our marriages, like he doesn't help us. We're not any more successful than people who deny God and deny his existence. So that seems to be, I think, the big kind of tough thing. I mean, this guy's a pastor. You got to realize he's a pastor. He dedicated his life and his profession to proclaiming Christ and the good news of Christ and the hope that coming to knowledge of God will actually lead to some real changes in society and in individual lives. And when he posts these kind of statistics, he's obviously saying there's something missing, and what is it? And he's saying, well, it's a lot of these ideas about easy, frivolous divorce and remarriage. So the exception clause, let's get into it. This is what I said. Oh yeah, I forgot. So Matthew 5, this is the one where the one who got left. Uh, sorry. Saving for the causes her to commit the adultery. So this is where the person giving out the divorce causes the other person to become an adulterer. And in Matthew 19, it says, whoever puts away his wife, except it be for fornication, and marries another, commits adultery. So Matthew 5, it's the person who got left is being forced into adultery. And in Matthew 19, it's the poor person who's, handing out divorce papers that eventually becomes the adulterer. So a lot of adultery, I guess. They say that the primary mistake made by some of these reformers, as well as by modern theologians, is the sandwiching together of the ethics of divorce with those of remarriage. So they're basically going to say that the mistake people are making is if there is certain reasons that allow for divorce, you can't make a big, huge jump and go all the way to say, well, then you can get remarried. They're saying that that's never discussed in the scriptures, and people want to make that jump, and it's not surprising people want to make that jump. They were always, I'm sure, hoping to have a good marriage, and if the first one didn't work out, they probably still have the same desires to be in a good marriage. And if they don't think that it's possible that they can do that with their first spouse, then it's reasonable to think that there's a lot of fish in the sea, as we say, and that they could go out and find somebody else and give it another shot. And so it's all very practical and pragmatic, but these people say that's not actually condoned by the scriptures. We don't see that big jump as far as if you got divorced, then you can feel free to get remarried. In fact, everything that we just read here, it all says that you're not allowed to do that. So this is interesting. So it basically says that divorcing someone is sinful because it causes them to sin, and that the only exception was really is if your spouse has already committed adultery within your marriage, and then you divorce them, that you wouldn't cause them to become an adulterer. They already did that on their own. They decided to sleep around and go behind your back and cheat on you. So it's like, just because you sign some papers and give it to them, and they go out and get into another relationship, another sexual relationship, yeah, they're having adultery, but it wasn't you that did that to them. I mean, they did that on their own free will while they were married to you. So that's what they're saying. Yeah, so they just make the point that, see, you can see this right here. See how they use this word separate? It says, so again, what exactly is the exception? Jesus said the man is allowed for this one reason to separate. They don't even use the word divorce. They say separate from his wife for sexual immorality. But remarriage is still not granted here. It's not even hinted at, is what they're saying. Trying to make this exception in Matthew 5:32 apply to remarriage would be stretching this text to say something that it simply does not say. So you can see what they're saying. It's like if people break up, you can stamp the word divorce on it, but for this group, it's nothing ever more than just a separation. For them, there's really no such thing as divorce because they don't think that that's even they don't think that there's any way to dissolve the vow or dissolve the fleshly bonding together. They think only death can do that, and so that's why they call it separation here. They don't even. I'm surprised they even use the word divorce. Really, they probably shouldn't. But marrying a divorcee, see, we get confused because then they come right back at us and they use this word divorcee. Like, why don't they just say like marrying a separated person? I guess they couldn't say that. That would be also very confusing. People would say, "Oh, I'm not separated. I'm divorced, so this doesn't apply to me." But anyway, they talk about marrying a divorced person. It should be pretty clear because we already talked about those verses. It said very clearly that marrying a divorced person is adultery. The Jewish betrothal, they talk about this thing where, what if you're basically talking about an engagement period? And you guys can read this, but what it basically says is like, if you have a situation where someone is, sleeping around during a engagement, then you would be able to break off the engagement with them and still be free to remarry. I mean, you've never been remarried. That's basically what you've never been married. I mean, you were considering it, you were engaged to be married, but since you never tied the knot, as they say, you never became one flesh with them. If they mess things up, or even if they didn't mess things up, if you just decide, you know what, we have different professional goals, like, I'm gonna decide not to marry this person after all. Obviously you would still be able to go out and get remarried. That's all this is saying. The Matthew 19 account says you can read this thing two ways. Okay, so what I'll say on this is like there's two ways to read Matthew 19, and I really like the way that they describe it. Basically, what it's saying is, does this exception refer to the first and the second part of the sentence, or just the first part? So we'll go down here and look at this context, but what they're basically saying is that if you look at the context of all these different verses, I mean, they suggest that you're not able to get remarried. But what they said is that when Jesus was talking about this with the disciples, I mean, he basically told them what he thought, and they had a response. And it wasn't like, oh, okay, that seems reasonable. They were very shocked. They were like, Jesus, what the heck are you talking about? Like, uh, if that's the case, then it's just better not to get remarried. And you can see that their reaction in uh, Matthew 19. Because he goes on to talk about how some people will become eunuchs for the kingdom of God. And it's like, I think that's the hard thing for us. It's like, did someone make us eunuchs against our will? And it's like, I mean, what the heck? What is that? Like, why do I even want that? I mean, that's like a huge decision, and to have somebody else be able to make that decision on my behalf because, I trusted them and married them, and it's like that doesn't seem like that should be something that they get to decide, but that's what they're basically saying. Why the apostles were so shocked. Now this is one interesting thing because they say here, look, it says, they ask, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause at all? And they're paraphrasing, but they say, well, it's always wrong to divorce what God has joined together. Uh, so it's always wrong. And what's more, if you decide to go out and get remarried, then it's a second sin. Now, one thing that's interesting to me, and I put this big question mark over here, is because, look, if that's the case, then why is there this weird passage in 1 Corinthians 7, which basically instructs a wife not to separate from her husband. But then it says, but if she does, she must remain unmarried or be reconciled to him. To me, it's like, well, if divorce is always wrong, uh, then why does Paul seem to allow it in First Corinthians, where a person can just say, fine, like I don't need to be remarried. I'm just going to go and be like a hermit. It's like, well, okay, uh, that's fine, except when you get married, you kind of make certain commitments, promises. There's like two people involved in that decision, and that there's certain commitments that spouses make to each other. Uh, and if one person just kind of, it's like if one person just decides like, I'm just going to go get my own place and do my own thing, and I'll maybe see you at Christmas. It's like, that's not marriage. I mean, I don't know what that is, but you know, no one I would know would be like, okay, yeah, like that's reasonable. That's reasonable. Like, do that. It'll just be like kind of a outside of the box relationship, right? Like, no, like, you know, I think there's certain understood things, including the sexual part of where First Corinthians says that, people, they don't own their own bodies even, when it comes to sex, that that you give those to your spouse when you get married. And if you didn't understand that, like, you should have been well aware before you got into something like that, that it's like that's how it works. And so no, you just don't get to do whatever you want, or move to the other side of the world or whatever. Like it has to be something that both people agree on. That's what the verse says, is unless both people agree. But anyway, I love this. Check this one out. I'll just let you guys read it. I'll read it. Okay. So check this out. They're gonna put in anger and murder, because there's this very similar thing where Jesus said, if a brother has anger in his heart, it's the same as if he murdered him. Like, it's the same intent on the heart level, which is very, very similar to this idea that we just talked about, where if you have lust in your heart, sexual lust in your heart, it's on the same level of intent or whatever as actually, committing adultery. So they say, well, since we have those two examples, let's swap these out. We'll put the anger thing in here and see if it helps us understand. So this is like rewritten Matthew 15. If anyone who is angry with his brother, unless it's for a just cause, anyone who is angry with his brother, unless it's for a just cause, has committed a sin. Okay, so if you get angry, so it's possible to get angry and not sin. Yeah? Okay. What about Luke 16? Anyone who is angry with his brother and kills him has committed a sin. So this is like we said before, there's no exception clause. It's just like, you get angry, you sin. So you divorce somebody, you sin. But Matthew has this exception clause. So maybe you got angry and, it's acceptable, it's understandable. What about this? Anyone who has killed his brother after being angry with him has committed a sin. Yeah, you killed him. He was your brother, so you shouldn't have killed him. So yeah, you always commit a sin. Now this is the kicker right here. Anyone who is angry with his brother, unless it's for a just cause, and kills him, has committed a sin. You get this one? So here's the thing. This, unless it's for a just cause, does it apply? The point they're trying to make is, does it apply to both parts? Is angry and kills, so both verbs, or does it apply just to this beginning part? So basically, anyone who is angry with his brother, unless it's for a just cause, and kills him, has committed a sin. Well, which one of these would we say is the thing that got this person in trouble, into sin? Was it being angry? No, it was probably the killing, right? It was the killing part that was the sinful part. And, would you say that, well, what if he had a just cause for being angry? Maybe like, his brother lied to him. So is he justified in his anger? Yes. Is he justified in the murder? No. And that's what they're trying to say with this is like everyone who murders somebody, they're going to be guilty. It doesn't it's like you can have the right to be angry, so you can have the right to divorce somebody, but you can't have the right to remarry. This would be the and marries another, you know. You get that? It's pretty clever. I really like how they did that. Told you it was a good article. Okay, so they cover the exception clause, which is quite tricky. Now they're going to go to this one other thing. This is from 1 Corinthians 13. This whole bit that, like Pastor John Piper, he talked about, not under bondage. This is this idea where if someone is abandoned, that many Protestants will say, well, if they're abandoned, then they can get remarried. Well, isn't everybody who's in the separation situation abandoned, technically? I mean, separation or divorce, couldn't someone say, well, they abandoned me, so, or if they didn't talk to you or you're having a fight, couldn't you say, like, well, they emotionally abandoned me, or, they verbally abandoned me, or, whatever, they didn't, blah, blah, blah. So, again, they're just summarizing. They're just going to go back and summarize because I put these all together into one PDF, but they didn't come out as one PDF. Basically, divorcing a wife and marrying another is adultery. Marrying someone who has been divorced is adultery. And that if you divorce your spouse for any reason except fornication, you cause them to become adulterous. So it's your fault that they're living in adultery. So that's just the highlights. They are going to talk about, here we go, 1 Corinthians. They were asking about what do you do if you're a Christian person married to a non-Christian person and that Christian person, ducks out of the marriage and takes off. What do you do? And so coming into chapter 7, Paul has just finished a difficult and heated rebuke of the men of the church for going to prostitutes. From the context flowing into chapter 7, it appears that Paul may also be correcting overly strict chastity standards by the Christian wives, implying that this may partly be a cause for the failure of their husbands. Yeah, I don't know about overly strict chastity standards, but I mean, to me it sounds like like if you vote for Trump, I'm not having sex with you. You guys heard about that stuff where let's be honest, people use sex as a way to get what they want, and it's really sad. But I don't think overly strict chastity standards quite gets to the point. But anyway, so he's saying that people shouldn't divorce. However, the question remains, what do you do if the divorce happens beyond your control, or even following the line with the teachings of Jesus? What do you do if a separation occurs because of fornication? Paul taught that Jesus did not leave us to wonder. He finished this command of Christ saying, but if she departs, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband put his wife away. Very simply put, Paul is telling the Christian church that Jesus taught divorce is not allowed, and if a divorce or separation should occur, the only two options open to us are reconciliation or remain single. Now, they go on and they talk about, do things change if it's a married person, a believing Christian person married to an unbeliever? And he basically quotes this section. He says, but I speak to the rest, I not the Lord. If any brother hath a wife that believeth not, and she is pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. And the woman who hath a husband that believeth not, if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now they are holy. Just meaning that the kids and the spouse, the unbelieving spouse, are exposed to some of the fruits, the benefits of the joy of the Christian life, the instructions on love and forgiveness, etc., that they all benefit from that, and so in some sense are blessed, made holy, affected by those things. But what if they're not pleased to dwell with you and they demand that they're going to divorce or leave? Now, this was a difficult situation because Jesus said that divorce, even without remarriage, was wrong. Remember that Jesus taught that to separate from a spouse for anything other than adultery was actually to cause your spouse's future adultery. So, I mean, they're basically saying, like, this shouldn't be done because of the future consequences. Now, here's the kicker, though. It says that he tells them that they need not to fret and fight with them to keep them at home. He released them and let their unbelieving spouse go. But if the unbelieving depart, let them depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God hath called us to live at peace. For what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? Or what knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife? So they put not under bondage in bold because, well, this is the controversy. Does not under bondage mean, it clearly means not under bondage to stay and to fight with them. Um, but the question is, does it mean that they are then free to remarry? And this is exactly what it says. It may imply that some people have taken Paul's words here, not under bondage, or especially the New International Version translation, is not bound in such circumstances, to imply that because the spouse left home, or rather deserted, that marriage bond is now broken and the person is free to marry again. However, the overall context of this chapter does not support this view, considering what Paul said a few verses before, and even a few verses after these verses, which is really true if you look at how 1 Corinthians 7 is concluded. Man, it really gives you a sense that divorce not and remarriage is not allowable. But they're basically just going to make the point that if he told a wife not to depart, and that if she did, she should remain unmarried or be reconciled, that if he was to then go on and to say, well, if there's a separation, then you're not bound anymore, those two statements would be conflicting, and so it wouldn't make any sense. It wouldn't have continuity there. But this is the part that I really love, because they break it down in the Greek, which is so hard for many of us who don't know Greek, and we don't, we're not professionally trained. But again, this guy, John Piper, makes his observations about the use of the Greek. It says the word for bond in 15 is not the same. So this is the 1:15 is where, I'm going to actually look this up really quick. 15 reads, yet if the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or the sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. So this is the one that we're starting out with. It says, the word used for bound here in verse 15 is not the same word used in verse 39, where Paul says, a wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. Paul consistently uses the second verb when speaking of the legal aspect of being bound to one marriage partner. So this is like he uses this in Romans 7, he uses this in 1 Corinthians 7:39, or to someone you're engaged to in 1 Corinthians 7 again. But he refers to a deserted spouse not being bound in 1 Corinthians 7:15 that I just read. He chooses a totally different word, which is, I don't know, doulou. which we would expect him to do if he were not giving a deserted spouse the same freedom to remarry that he gives to a spouse whose partner has died. The last phrase of verse 15, God has called us to peace, supports verse 15 best if Paul is saying that a deserted partner is not bound to make war on the deserting unbeliever or to get him or her to stay. It seems to me that the peace God has called us to is the peace of marital harmony. Therefore, if an unbelieving partner insists on departing, then the believing partner is not bound to live in perpetual conflict with the unbelieving spouse, but is free and innocent in letting him or her go. It says that John concludes that this controversial passage, 1 Corinthians 7:15, does not mean that when a Christian is deserted by an unbelieving spouse, he or she is free to remarry. It means that the Christian is not bound to fight in order to preserve togetherness. Separation is permissible if the unbelieving partner insists on it. I think this is really interesting because it seems to say that if this person who wants to leave is a Christian, that they would be held to a different standard, that they would be expected to reconcile. But since here we're talking about an unbelieving person, things are a little bit different. The main point that they're trying to make, though, is that there's no freedom to remarry. Then they make this thing, what happens before conversion? And I wonder what they're going to say, because people say different things. Some people say, well, there's basically two views. Well, one group says, well, listen, if I was married before and then I became a Christian, we all know that the picture of baptism is that that old person dies and the new person is raised to life, newness in Christ. The other passages talk about there being a whole new creation. And so some people say, look, that was my old life. I did die, therefore death separated me from my old spouse. And so now it's like, because the death has separated me from my old spouse, I'm free to remarry. Or other people will say, well, look, yes, I was married before I became a Christian, but how can you hold me accountable to these standards that I didn't ever agree to live by before becoming a Christian? I should be able to kind of start over, have like a reset, because that's essentially, I changed my whole perspective on life and everything, my allegiances when I became a Christian. So, they make that argument. We'll see what these guys say. So they basically say if I sinned or I wrecked my marriage in the first marriage before I was a Christian, then don't I get a second chance now that I'm a Christian? And they're probably going to make some kind of they basically say like, look, if you get a DUI or something before you come to Christ, you can come to Christ and receive His forgiveness, but you're still going to have high driver's insurance. That effect is still going to basically be. They're basically saying that marriage, even amongst unbelieving people, is still legitimate marriage, and to ask God to put a stamp of approval on just because one person came to Christ. Yeah. This is a really great article, you guys. It's just a bit long because there's a lot trying to tackle all these topics at once. There's this other argument where people say from 1 Corinthians 7 that I'll just read it here. Now concerning virgins, I have no command of the Lord, yet I give my judgment as one who hath obtained mercy from the Lord to be faithful. So they're saying that this is talking to betrothed couples or engaged couples. and there was like a distress, there was like a big famine or some kind of problem going on during that time. And so he was just giving the advice that uh, it is fine that they don't have to get remarried, and and that if they were to call off the engagement, that they're free to stay single moving forward, or they're free to remarry, and that they're not in sin on either way. This is no different than the other engagement thing that we just talked about a couple pages before. The modern confusion that they're going to talk about here is that basically people will grab this verse and they'll say, uh, they'll basically argue that Paul isn't talking about engaged people. They're basically going to say he was talking about engaged people, but he's not anymore. And so now, because he says this thing that um, you don't sin by remarrying, that applies to everybody on the planet. And they're going to basically say, you can just see right here, some have ignored these indications that this is the beginning of a new section now concerning virgins. So they say if you leave that part out or you ignore that part, then you might be able to land on a position where you're able to remarry. But since now concerning virgins is in there, when he says that, it's only concerning virgins, uh, i.e., the unmarried, i.e., people looking to enter their first marriage. But he says, "Art thou loosed from a wife? Then seek not a wife. But if thou marry, thou have not sinned." And people try to use this verse as a license for remarriage post-divorce. It says they attempt to tie this passage back into the previous verses dealing with the deserted individual, and that they insist that Paul is still addressing the issue of the deserted spouse from the preceding section, and thereby conclude that Paul is making yet another argument for remarriage. Some support this argument by saying that the word wife in this passage demands that this section refers to a married person. Now, this is another reason why I love this article, because look, if I'm going along and I'm reading and I see the word wife, and then I read that she's able to be remarried or able to get remarried, and I think, well, she's a wife and she's, yeah. But look what he says. He says, while this point might be substantiated in the English language, it must be taken into consideration that the word wife in Greek is simply the word for woman, and it does not make a distinction. Furthermore, when considering the totality of the passage, presenting the word beyond this becomes such a big stretch. And this is one of the reasons why I really like the work that they're doing here, is because it helps you. I mean, without this article, I wouldn't know the difference between if it said wife or woman. And honestly, it makes a huge difference. Uh, Wife always suggests someone who's married, or married, but a woman, it's could just be talking about virgins. So, yeah. So again, they just go on to make this idea, this point that they're talking about people that are engaged or betrothed to be married. This final word on the marriage bond. It's just they go back and they said that death separates the the two individuals from the marriage that they had. You see the same thing in Romans 7. I'll let you guys read that. We'll just jump down to the conclusion because I think they're about made all the points they're going to make. They're going to just say that the marriage bond is for life, and that any divorce in the eyes of man is merely a separation. And see, that's what I was saying before. They don't believe in divorce. They believe that the worst a couple can ever get to is separation. Therefore, if a divorce occurs, only two opinions are open to the couple: either be reconciled or remain single. And then they just go back. They say, look, as a pastor, he says he realizes that these teachings are really hard. Um, and that it's not just like some document or some PDF or some argument, that these are real people, with real pain in their past and real hopes for, being married, having families, things like that. That's what I read as a guy, going through this whole situation is like, you know, um, I mean, he basically goes on to say that like there's a bunch of mistakes, hundreds of years old mistakes about the teachings in Protestant churches, primarily Luther, Calvin, and going back to this translation thing that we had with Erasmus. Um, he says that if we're going to live the life the right way, that we got to start. We got to ask God for discernment and direction, believing that the scriptures are inspired and it's profitable to us. He also, just calls us that, our lives are going to have a testimony to everyone that we come in contact with. And so, he always said that it's important that we live in such a way that, we don't teach other people to break the commandments of God by our own actions, by our own, what we decide to do. But that we should basically be not just hearers of the word, but doers as well. Chapter 5, part 5, this is just basically a cool thing, but I've covered this before, and it's not bad. You can look it up and check it out for yourself. It's basically just, it looks at some of the things that happened in the early church and how different their views are kind of compared to now. Although from what I've looked at, you really have people all over the board across the centuries, and that, many people were struggling. One of the big outcomes of this, which has always surprised me, is that I came from a Reformed background, which Reformed background essentially, one of the big tenets is that if like once saved, always saved. That if you come to know Christ, that His blood is gonna pay the debt of your sin, no matter what happens. And there's another group that, I haven't been around much, but they basically say like, look, that's true, but if you decide to sabotage your own faith and, you pursue sin and you walk away from Christ, even though He's, embraced you, that, He'll still give you the ability um, to sabotage that relationship. And that's interesting because I think so many modern Protestants, they kind of fall into this once saved, always saved mentality, and they say, well, look, this is a big mess, and uh, you know, suppose all the arguments go against me, and it ends up I stand in judgment, and God says that I'm guilty of adultery, of like many years of adultery. Uh, they're just going to say, well, that's just one of the things that God is going to forgive me for amongst all the other things in my life. And some people really say, that is not how it works. Um, these people say really that God calls us to repent, and this is what David Pawson has said as well, that repentance really means like leaving a marriage, an adulterous marriage, a sinful marriage, even if it seems to be enjoyable. Um, so you can look at some of these people, Justin Martyr. might read through these on a different video, but one thing I think is really interesting is that, these are, I mean, these are basically like some of the famous pastors of the early church, and they're basically, towing the party line. They're basically saying, they're quoting the scriptures and they're saying these things, and just to going back to what I said earlier, it's one thing to read some articles, to read a book, but one thing I'm trying to do with this channel is to really set up a thing to help myself and help you guys out there, you know, have a decent shot at, if you believe that this is the right thing to do, or maybe if you're not sure and you're going to just put your ring on and not date and, pray while you figure it out, then, I mean, that makes sense to me as well. But I think there's just something that can be said about, it's much different of a thing to write articles from, your office at your desk and talk about these things, and then go home to your wife and kids, sit down for dinner, and go for a walk, versus the experience of being in the middle of separation or divorce and have to sort through the real day-to-day implications, the things that really um, are kind of the meat and the potatoes of what this would all mean for a person. So that's it. I'm going to scroll back up to the top so you guys get another chance to just see what this is. Epiphrat Ministries, The One Flesh, One Covenant by Dean Taylor.